Story number 1.
The night was heavy, with a mist that clung to the streets like a damp blanket, muffling the usual sounds of the city. Officer Greg Turner sat in his squad car at the edge of Blackwood Forest, sipping lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos. It was the graveyard shift, the kind he usually dreaded, but something about this night felt different. Dispatch crackled in his radio. Unit 47, we've got a disturbance reported near the old Blackwood Asylum. Some kids say they heard screams coming from inside. Can you check it out? Greg sighed and grabbed his flashlight. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls and shattered windows a testament to its haunted reputation. He had been there before, once on a dare as a rookie and once on a call about vandals. Both times he left with an uneasy feeling he couldn't explain. Arriving at the asylum's rusted gate, Greg hesitated. The building loomed before him like a skeletal giant, its silhouette fractured against the moonlight. He pushed open the gate, its metallic groan echoing louder than it should have in the silence. Inside, the air was colder, and the musty stench of decay filled his nostrils. His boots crunched on broken glass as he swept his flashlight across the graffiti-covered walls. He told himself the screams were just the wind or some animals, but then he heard it. A faint, guttural cry. It wasn't the wind. Police! Is anyone in here? Greg called out, his voice firm but edged with unease. The sound echoed back to him, bouncing through the empty corridors. The cry came again, closer this time. Greg followed it, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned a corner into what used to be the main hall. The remnants of hospital beds and wheelchairs were scattered like forgotten toys. That's when he saw her. A woman stood at the far end of the room, her back to him. She wore a tattered hospital gown, her hair matted and filthy. Her shoulders shook as if she were sobbing. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" Greg approached cautiously, his flashlight trained on her. She didn't respond. Greg stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am, I'm with the police. Can you turn around for me?" Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she did. Her face was a twisted mask of torment. Hollow, black eyes stared at him, and her mouth gaped open in a silent scream. Her skin was gray, mottled, and stretched taut over her skull. Greg stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand. The woman let out a piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Greg's knees buckled, and he hit the floor hard. The air grew thick, and the walls around him seemed to warp and close in. "Officer Turner." The voice was a whisper, yet it filled the room. Greg froze. No one had used his name. "Why didn't you save me?" His breath caught. The voice was familiar. It was her, Lisa Cummings. She had gone missing 5 years ago, her case unsolved. He had been the lead officer, and he had failed her. I tried," Greg stammered. The room shifted, and suddenly he was no longer in the asylum. He was back in Lisa's apartment, standing over the blood-stained carpet. Her mother's sobs echoed in his ears, and the weight of guilt crushed his chest. "You didn't try hard enough," the voice hissed. Greg turned to run, but the asylum was back. He stumbled into the hallway, the walls closing in like a suffocating tunnel. The cries started again, but now they were everywhere. Dozens of voices, men, women, and children, screaming, wailing, begging. "Help us. Why didn't you save me?" "Officer Turner." He fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the voices only grew louder. Shadows danced on the walls, faces appearing and disappearing, their hollow eyes boring into him. Greg scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get out. The corridors twisted and stretched impossibly, the building becoming a labyrinth. Then he saw it, a door at the end of the hall, bathed in an eerie, flickering light. He bolted toward it, the voices chasing him, the air growing colder with each step. He flung the door open and stumbled into the night. The asylum was gone. Greg found himself in his squad car, parked at the edge of Blackwood Forest. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The radio crackled. "Unit 47, what's your status?" Greg fumbled for the mic. "I'm fine. Just checked the area. Nothing to report." There was a pause. "Unit 47, are you sure? We just received another call about screams coming from the asylum." Greg stared at the forest, the mist swirling like ghostly figures. He didn't respond. The radio crackled again. "Unit 47?" But Greg was already driving away, his headlights cutting through the fog. He didn't look back. He never worked another night shift again. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It had been a long shift for Officer Claire Daniels. A seasoned cop in her early 30s, Claire had worked through her fair share of late-night calls. The city was quiet that evening, and there was nothing out of the ordinary on her patrol. Her car cruised down the same familiar streets, the radio barely crackling with updates, and her mind wandered. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, and there were no signs of trouble. The call came in around 2:30 a.m. Unit 47, we've received a disturbance report from the old hospital on Maple Street. Caller claims they've heard footsteps inside an abandoned building. No signs of entry, but we need you to check it out. Over. Claire raised an eyebrow. The building in question had been abandoned for years. The old hospital had been decommissioned decades ago after a series of lawsuits and allegations of malpractice, but it had become a local landmark over time, mostly because people claimed it was haunted. Of course, Claire had always dismissed the rumors. She'd never been one to entertain such superstitions. Unit 47, copy. I'm en route, Claire replied, her voice steady. It wasn't far. Claire turned the patrol car onto Maple Street, the headlights piercing through the fog that had begun to roll in. She had passed the old hospital hundreds of times, but tonight, something felt different. The air seemed denser, heavier, as though the fog wasn't just a natural weather phenomenon. It felt oppressive. As she neared the hospital, Claire noticed the faint flicker of light through the broken windows. At first, she thought it was a trick of the fog, but as she pulled into the parking lot, she saw it more clearly, a dim, flickering light coming from the upper floors. That's odd, Claire muttered to herself. The building had been vacant for years. Who would be up there? Her car door slammed shut as she stepped out, the air unusually cold for spring. She grabbed her flashlight and radio, checking her gear one last time before approaching the entrance. The large metal doors of the hospital were slightly ajar, an eerie creak escaping as she nudged them open. The smell of mildew and old wood hit her immediately, stale, damp air that seemed to hang in the very walls of the place. "Police!" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "Anyone here? Come out now!" There was no answer, no sound except the faint hum of the flickering lights overhead. She cautiously stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The building was exactly as she remembered it from the outside, dusty, decaying, abandoned. Her boots echoed as she walked down the hallway, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Everything looked untouched. There were no signs of recent activity, no broken windows or discarded trash that usually indicated squatters. Yet the light on the upper floor remained, flickering like a weak flame, struggling against the dark. As Claire made her way to the stairs, a faint noise caught her attention. A sound that was almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. Footsteps. They were soft, slow, deliberate. Claire froze. She had been trained to stay alert in situations like this. But something about those footsteps felt wrong. They weren't the sound of someone walking, more like a dragging shuffle, a slow, agonizing movement. "Hello?" She called again, this time more cautiously. Her voice trembled slightly as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. "I'm Officer Daniels. If you're in there, you need to come out now." She paused, listening. The footsteps stopped. With a deep breath, Claire continued up the stairs, the heavy wooden steps creaking beneath her weight. The light above her flickered again, and as she rounded the corner at the top of the stairs, she saw something that made her heart race. Someone standing at the end of the hallway. A shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. The figure was tall, hunched over as if leaning against the wall for support. "Police! Identify yourself!" Claire ordered, her voice shaking with an authority she didn't feel. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. She approached slowly, her gun now in her hand, ready to react if needed. As she drew closer, the figure didn't move, and she began to feel a creeping dread settle into her gut. There was something wrong with this situation, something that didn't feel right. When she was only a few feet away, she called out again, "I'm warning you. I'll have to arrest you for trespassing if you don't." Before she could finish her sentence, the figure turned toward her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The person was gone. In their place stood only a cracked, dusty mirror, reflecting the empty hallway. Her pulse quickened. The footsteps had stopped, and the figure, the person, had disappeared. Had it been a trick of the light? some sort of hallucination caused by the years of decay in the building? But as Claire stood there staring at the mirror, something caught her eye. There, faintly reflected in the glass, was a figure. This time, not a shadow, but a woman. She was pale, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, and her eyes were wide with an unnatural, unblinking stare. The reflection moved, but the woman didn't look at Claire. Instead, her eyes were fixed on something just beyond her, something in the distance. Claire's hand shook as she raised her flashlight toward the mirror, but when she looked back, the woman was gone. There was a long moment of silence. Then, from behind her, Claire heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, a slow, labored breath, heavy with the weight of exhaustion or pain. Turning quickly, Claire raised her flashlight, shining it behind her. The hallway was empty. Panic rose in her chest. She could feel it now, the unmistakable presence of something else in the room with her. The oppressive atmosphere that had once felt distant now seemed to be closing in on her, suffocating her. "Dispatch, I need backup," she said urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm hearing things, and I don't know what's going on, but I need backup here now." There was no response. Her radio crackled again, but the words that followed were distorted, indecipherable. She hit the button again, but the static was all that answered. A soft, dragging noise came from behind her. She spun around. The hallway was empty. But the air had changed. It was colder now, and the silence felt suffocating. The faintest echo of footsteps came again, this time closer. Someone, or something, was walking toward her. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she backed away down the hallway. She didn't care if it was a person or a ghost. She needed to get out. She turned to leave, but stopped in her tracks. At the far end of the hallway, the doors to the old operating room swung open. The air around the door seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off the pavement in summer. Something or someone was standing in the dark, just beyond the threshold. Claire could feel the hair on her arms rise. Her flashlight flickered again, and she was suddenly aware of the cold, the silence, the feeling of being watched. She had seen enough horror movies to know the moment she crossed that threshold, there would be no turning back. With one final look at the darkened door, she bolted. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her boots pounding against the old floors as she made her way back down the staircase and out of the building. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she was back in her patrol car, slamming the door shut behind her. The fog had thickened, and the once familiar building now looked like something out of a nightmare. Claire's hands shook as she fumbled for the keys, her mind racing. She started the engine, threw the car into drive, and sped away. She never went back to the Grayson Hospital, and no one ever spoke about it again. But every time Claire passed by, she couldn't help but glance up at the windows. The lights still flickered in the upper floors, and sometimes, just sometimes, she could swear she saw something moving inside. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was nearing midnight, and Officer Rachel Hayes was patrolling the quiet outskirts of Ashwood, a small, sleepy town surrounded by dense woods and winding back roads. The night was calm, with only the occasional flicker of a street lamp or the distant howl of a coyote breaking the stillness. Rachel adjusted the radio volume in her cruiser, half listening to the dispatcher's monotone updates. Unit 14, the voice crackled suddenly, startling her, respond to a 10 to 37. Suspicious activity reported near Old Creek Bridge, possible trespassing. Rachel frowned. Old Creek Bridge had been closed for years, ever since the tragic accident in 1998. 2 officers, Sergeant David Cole and rookie Paul Sims, had gone missing during a routine call there. Their squad car was found abandoned near the bridge, but the men were never seen again. The disappearance was the stuff of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones over coffee or beer. Rachel didn't believe in ghost stories, though. She was practical, grounded, and determined to prove herself in a department where she was still seen as the new girl. 10 to 4, she responded, gripping the steering wheel. Her headlights cut through the fog as she turned onto the desolate road leading to the bridge. The trees closed in on either side like dark, skeletal fingers, and the radio buzzed with faint static, an eerie contrast to the otherwise silent night. As she approached the bridge, the cruiser's headlights illuminated the warped wooden planks and rusted steel beams. The air felt heavy, thicker somehow, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She slowed the car to a stop and stepped out, her boots crunching on the gravel. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the woods were holding their breath. "Police! If anyone's out here, show yourself!" she called, her voice steady. There was no response, just the gentle creak of the bridge swaying in the night breeze. Rachel reached for her flashlight, sweeping its beam across the area. The trees cast long, jagged shadows, and for a moment she thought she saw movement near the center of the bridge. "Hello?" she called again, taking cautious steps forward. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She reached the middle of the bridge and froze. There, etched into the wooden planks beneath her feet, were deep, jagged scratches, as if someone had clawed at the wood in desperation. They were uneven and frantic, like the marks of someone trying to escape. Her heart quickened. She crouched down, running her fingers over the grooves, and noticed something else. Dried bloodstains, faint but unmistakable, spattered across the planks. Before she could process the discovery, a sound shattered the stillness. A low, guttural groan that seemed to come from beneath the bridge. Rachel's flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged, but she forced herself to stay calm, drawing her sidearm and backing away slowly. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. The groan came again, louder this time, followed by what sounded like faint whispers. They were indistinct, overlapping, as if a crowd of unseen voices was murmuring just out of earshot. Rachel's pulse thundered in her ears as she scanned the area, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark. Then she saw it, a faint, flickering light at the far end of the bridge. It wasn't the warm glow of a flashlight or lantern. It was cold, bluish, and unsteady, like the flame of a dying candle. Against her better judgment, Rachel moved toward the light, her weapon raised. As she drew closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could make out fragments of sentences now. "Help us. Don't leave. Why didn't you come?" The voices seemed to surround her, pressing in from all sides. The light suddenly flared brighter, and Rachel stopped in her tracks. Standing at the edge of the bridge was a figure. It was a man in a police uniform, his back to her. The patches on his shoulders were faded, but she could make out the name. Cole. Her stomach dropped. "Sergeant Cole?" she called hesitantly. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, staring into the woods beyond the bridge. "Sergeant Cole," she tried again, louder this time. "It's Officer Hayes. Are you?" Her words caught in her throat as the figure turned to face her. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow sockets that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Blood streaked his uniform, and his lips moved, but no sound came out. Rachel stumbled back, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick, some cruel joke, but deep down she knew it wasn't. The whispers turned into screams, and the air around her grew icy. The bridge seemed to shudder beneath her feet, and Rachel realized she wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their forms twisted and incomplete, like half-formed memories. They reached for her with translucent hands, their faces etched with anguish. "Why didn't you help us?" one of them sobbed, its voice piercing and accusatory. "We called for you. We begged." Rachel stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering back to life. The beam caught the figures, and for a brief moment she saw their faces, men, women, children, all of them pale and lifeless, their eyes filled with despair. And among them she recognized Sergeant Cole and Officer Sims, their ghostly forms standing at the forefront. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I wasn't even here when it happened." The figures didn't seem to care. They surged closer, their voices rising in a deafening cacophony. Rachel turned and ran, her boots pounding against the wooden planks. The bridge seemed to stretch endlessly, the far side always just out of reach. She could feel the icy fingers of the spirits brushing against her back, their anguished cries echoing in her ears. Just when she thought she couldn't run any farther, the mist cleared, and she stumbled off the bridge, collapsing onto the gravel. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. Rachel looked back, her chest heaving, but the bridge was empty. The figures were gone, and the flickering light had vanished. She sat there for a long moment, trying to steady her breathing. Her radio crackled to life, making her jump. "Unit 14, what's your status?" the dispatcher asked, sounding distant and distorted. Rachel fumbled for the mic. I'm fine. Nothing to report, she lied, her voice shaky. She glanced at the bridge one last time before climbing back into her cruiser. The scratches and bloodstains still haunted her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to go back and confirm they were real. As she drove away, the faint sound of whispers followed her, fading into the distance, but never quite disappearing. She didn't stop until she was back at the station, the lights of the town a welcome relief after the suffocating darkness of the woods. Rachel never told anyone about what she saw that night. The official report simply stated that the area was clear and no suspicious activity was found. But every time she passed by Old Creek Bridge on patrol, she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, and she knew the spirits of that place were still waiting for justice, for answers, or maybe just for peace. She hoped they would find it someday, but she wouldn't be the one to face them again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a late autumn evening when Officer Daniel Brooks found himself working the night shift in the small rural town of Maple Hollow. The town, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, was usually quiet, too quiet. But tonight, a chill in the air and the eeriness of the empty streets made Daniel uneasy. His cruiser radio crackled suddenly, shattering the silence. Unit 22, this is dispatch. We've got a 10-7-1-71 reports of shots fired near the old Ridgeway Station. Can you respond? Ridgeway Station. The name alone was enough to make Daniel's stomach tighten. Abandoned for decades, the station was notorious for its dark history. Stories of suicides, accidents, and disappearances surrounded it, and locals avoided it like the plague. But Daniel had a job to do. 10-4 dispatch, en route now, he replied, suppressing the unease creeping up his spine. The drive to Ridgeway Station was short, but as Daniel turned onto the narrow road leading to the site, the trees seemed to grow taller and denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. His headlights cut through the fog, revealing the crumbling structure ahead. The station's roof sagged under years of neglect and graffiti adorned its walls, but the air around it felt oppressive, as if the building itself were alive. Daniel parked his cruiser and stepped out, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the station, his breath visible in the cold air. "Police, is anyone here?" he called out, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. There was no response, just the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. He scanned the area, his flashlight revealing broken windows, rusted metal, and scattered debris. But then, just as he was about to radio back to dispatch, he heard it. A faint, hollow sound. It was crying. The sound was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder as Daniel moved closer to the station's entrance. It was the kind of crying that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end, desperate, sorrowful, and inhumanly hollow. He gripped his flashlight tighter and stepped inside. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. His boots echoed on the cracked tiles as he swept the beam of his flashlight across the room. The crying seemed to come from deeper within the building, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. "Hello? If you need help, I'm with the police," he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. Still, there was no response, just the crying, louder now, echoing through the empty corridors. Daniel followed the sound, his flashlight revealing peeling paint, rusted lockers, and remnants of old station equipment. As he turned a corner, he saw her. A woman sat slumped against the far wall, her face buried in her hands. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in damp, matted strands. Her shoulders shook with each sob, and her bare feet were streaked with dirt. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Daniel asked, approaching cautiously. The woman didn't respond. Her sobs grew louder, more anguished, as if she were reliving some unbearable pain. "Ma'am, I'm here to help. Please look at me," Daniel said, inching closer. As he reached out a hand to touch her shoulder, she stopped crying. The silence was deafening. Slowly, she lifted her head, and Daniel's blood ran cold. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and empty. Her mouth twisted into a ghastly smile, revealing teeth far too sharp and jagged to be human. Before Daniel could react, she let out an ear-piercing scream that seemed to shake the very walls of the station. The flashlight slipped from his hand as he stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The woman stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, and began walking toward him. Daniel turned and ran, his boots slipping on the damp floor as he bolted down the corridor. The sound of her footsteps, bare and wet, echoed behind him, growing closer with each passing second. "Dispatch! I need backup at Ridgeway Station now!" He shouted into his radio, but all he got in return was static. The exit was just ahead, the faint glow of his cruiser's headlights visible through the doorway. He burst outside, gasping for air, and spun around to face the station. But there was no sign of her. The doorway was empty, and the oppressive silence had returned. For a moment, Daniel thought it was over, but then the radio crackled to life. "Unit 22, why didn't you save me?" The voice was faint and distorted, but Daniel recognized it instantly. It was Officer Michael Carter, his former partner who had died on duty 2 years ago. Michael had been killed during a routine traffic stop gone wrong, and Daniel had always blamed himself for not acting quickly enough. "Michael?" Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "You left me," the voice said, filled with anguish. "You let me die." The lights on his cruiser flickered, and the air grew colder. Daniel felt a presence behind him, and as he turned, he saw not one figure, but several. They were officers, some in old-fashioned uniforms, others more recent, but all of them had the same hollow eyes and ghastly expressions. Among them was Michael, his uniform stained with blood, a gaping wound in his chest. "You could have saved us," one of the figures whispered. "You didn't even try," another said, their voice dripping with accusation. Daniel backed away, his hands trembling as he reached for his sidearm. "I don't know what you want from me," he shouted, his voice cracking. "We want you to remember," Michael said, stepping forward. "We want you to feel what we felt." Suddenly, the ground beneath Daniel gave way, and he was plunged into darkness. He felt as though he were falling forever, the cold air whipping past him as the voices of the dead surrounded him. When he hit the ground, he was back inside the station. The walls were covered in blood, and the cries of the woman echoed from every direction. The officers stood around him, their hollow eyes fixed on him. "You can't run from us," Michael said. "You can't run from the truth." Daniel screamed, the sound ripping from his throat as the figures closed in. Their cold hands grabbed at him, pulling him into the darkness. The next morning, when another officer arrived at Ridgeway Station to check on Daniel, they found his cruiser parked by the entrance, the engine still running. But Daniel was nowhere to be found. Inside the station, scrawled on the walls in what looked like blood, was a single word: guilty. Daniel Brooks was never seen again, but his disappearance became yet another story whispered about in Maple Hollow, another chapter in the dark legend of Ridgeway Station.
Story number 5.
Officer Mark Grayson had worked as a patrolman for 12 years in Southwick County, a quiet stretch of rural America dotted with small farms, dense forests, and the occasional long-forgotten building. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where crime was rare, and most police work involved handling stray livestock or the occasional drunk driver. That night, though, would be different. Mark was on the late shift, cruising the back roads and listening to the low hum of his radio. It was nearing 2 a.m. when the call came in. "Unit 17, the dispatcher's voice crackled. "Possible disturbance reported at the old Prescott house off Miller's Lane. Neighbor claims to have seen someone inside. Check it out." Mark frowned. The Prescott house had been abandoned for over 30 years. The story went that a man named Edward Prescott, a reclusive farmer, had lived there alone until he mysteriously disappeared in the late 1980s. No one ever found out what happened to him, and the property had since become overgrown and forgotten. Kids from the local high school liked to tell stories about it being haunted, but Mark didn't buy into that sort of thing. 10-4, he replied. The drive to Miller's Lane was uneventful, but as he neared the Prescott property, the mood shifted. The road grew darker, the trees thicker, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Mark's cruiser lights reflected off the overgrown path leading to the house. He parked and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The air was colder here, with a dampness that clung to his skin. The Prescott house loomed ahead, its sagging roof and broken windows giving it an almost skeletal appearance. Mark moved toward the house, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The door was slightly ajar, slur creaking as the wind nudged it back and forth. He called out, his voice firm but calm. "Southwick Police Department. If anyone's here, make yourself known." There was no response. Mark pushed the door open with his flashlight and stepped inside. The air was musty, thick with the scent of rot and mildew. Cobwebs draped the corners of the room and the floorboards groaned under his weight. The flashlight beams swept across the interior. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and a layer of dust that suggested no one had been here in years. Probably just some kids messing around, Mark muttered to himself, though his gut told him otherwise. He moved deeper into the house, his flashlight casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Then he heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone shuffling across the floor. "Police! Show yourself!" Mark called out again, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his sidearm. The sound came from the back of the house. Mark followed it, his heartbeat quickening. The rustling stopped as he reached the kitchen. The room was empty. But then the faint sound of whispering began. It was soft at first, barely audible, but grew louder, surrounding him. The voices overlapped, too many to count, speaking in hushed, frantic tones. Mark swung his flashlight around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse. And then he heard footsteps. They were coming from upstairs, slow and deliberate, the creak of each step echoing through the house. Mark hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling him to leave, but his training took over. He ascended the staircase, flashlight aimed ahead. The steps groaned beneath him, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him, the doors to the old bedrooms hanging off their hinges. "Police! If you're up here, come out now!" he called. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then one of the bedroom doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mark nearly jumped out of his skin. He drew his weapon, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip as he approached the door. He pushed it open cautiously, revealing a room empty except for a broken dresser and a shattered mirror leaning against the wall. The flashlight beam reflected off the shards of glass, casting strange patterns on the ceiling. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, there was a figure standing behind him. Mark spun around, his weapon raised, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there. A man in an old-fashioned suit, his face pale and gaunt, eyes dark and hollow. "Leave," the man whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with menace. Mark stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The mirror cracked suddenly, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. The figure disappeared, but the oppressive feeling in the room remained. Mark didn't wait to see what would happen next. He backed out of the room and made his way down the stairs, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. But as he reached the front door, it slammed shut in front of him. The whispers started again, louder this time, more frantic. The air grew colder, and Mark could see his breath in front of him, and then the voices spoke in unison. "You shouldn't have come here." Mark tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He turned, his back against the wood, his weapon drawn. The room around him seemed to shift and distort, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The figure from the mirror appeared again, this time at the base of the stairs. Behind him, other shapes began to form, more figures, all of them pale and lifeless, their hollow eyes fixed on Mark. "Leave," the first figure said again, his voice now a low growl. "I'm trying," Mark shouted, panic taking over. The figures moved closer, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. Mark banged on the door, desperate to escape, but it remained locked. The figures were only feet away now, their cold breath visible in the freezing air. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door flew open, and Mark stumbled out into the night, gasping for air. He turned back to the house, but the doorway was empty. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the night. Crickets, chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mark didn't wait. He got into his cruiser and drove back to the station, his hands trembling on the wheel. When he arrived, he filed a brief report. Responded to disturbance at the Prescott house. No evidence found. Situation resolved. He didn't mention the whispers, the figure, or the strange events. Who would believe him? But Mark never went back to the Prescott house, and every time he drove past Miller's Lane, he felt a chill run down his spine. The house remained abandoned, its secrets buried within its decaying walls. But Mark knew the truth. Some places were better left undisturbed. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Officer Maria Vasquez had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and urban legends were for kids and tourists, not for seasoned police officers like her. She prided herself on being level-headed, grounded, and logical, qualities that had served her well over her 10 years on the force. But that was before the call came in about the old Whitmore Bridge. The Whitmore Bridge had a reputation that went back decades. Spanning the narrow gorge of Deadwood Creek, it had been the site of numerous accidents, disappearances, and inexplicable deaths. The locals whispered about a spirit, the Woman of the Gorge, who was said to haunt the bridge, luring travelers to their doom. Maria had always dismissed these tales as small-town superstition. She didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in facts. It was a cold November night when dispatch radioed her about a report of a woman standing on the bridge. Unit 6, we've got a 10 to 96 at Whitmore Bridge. Witness says she's pacing near the edge and looks distressed. No further description available. Can you check it out? Maria sighed. 10-4, dispatch. En route. As she drove toward the bridge, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the trees lining the road. Her headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the isolated stretch of asphalt ahead. When she reached the bridge, she pulled over and stepped out of her cruiser, the cold biting through her uniform. The bridge loomed before her, its rusted iron rails glinting faintly in the moonlight. She swept her flashlight across the span, but at first she saw nothing. The wind whistled through the gorge below, carrying with it an eerie stillness that made her skin prickle. "South County Police," Maria called out, her voice firm but calm. "If you're out here, I'm here to help. Just come out where I can see you." At first, there was no response. Then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of sobbing. It was soft, almost inaudible over the wind, but unmistakable. Maria followed the sound, her boots crunching on the frost-covered pavement. As she reached the center of the bridge, she saw her. A woman stood near the edge, her back to Maria. She was wearing a long white dress, the fabric billowing in the wind. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves down her back, and her hands clutched the railing. Even from a distance, Maria could feel the woman's despair. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Maria called out, taking a cautious step forward. "I'm Officer Vasquez. I just want to make sure you're safe." The woman didn't respond. Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking with the force of them. Maria felt a pang of sympathy. She'd handled her fair share of suicidal individuals, and the key was always to stay calm and establish trust. "Ma'am, I know you're upset, but I need you to step away from the edge. We can talk, and I'll do everything I can to help you, okay?" Still no response. Maria took another step closer, her flashlight trained on the woman's back. "Please, just turn around and talk to me." The sobbing stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the entire world had paused. Maria froze, her grip tightening on the flashlight. The woman's head tilted slightly, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. And then, slowly, she turned around. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was wrong, terribly wrong. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, frozen in a grotesque smile that didn't match the anguish of her sobbing. Maria stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hands. "Ma'am, stay where you are," she shouted, her voice trembling. The woman stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold pavement. Her movements were unnatural, jerky, as though she were a marionette controlled by invisible strings. The wind howled around them, carrying with it a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why didn't you save me?" the woman whispered, her voice a hollow echo. Maria felt her blood run cold. She tried to respond, to say something, but her throat felt constricted, as if the air itself were pressing down on her. The woman took another step closer, her hollow eyes locking onto Maria's. "Why didn't you save me?" she repeated, louder this time, her voice filled with sorrow and anger. Maria backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she shouted. "I don't know you." The woman's smile twisted into a snarl. "You don't know me, but I know you," she hissed. "You drive past here every night. You never stop. You never look." Maria's mind raced. She thought back to the countless nights she'd driven this road, the bridge a fleeting blur in her rearview mirror. Had she missed something? Someone? Guilt clawed at her chest, but she shook it off. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "Stay back," Maria warned, her hand moving to her sidearm. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." The woman laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the gorge. "You can't hurt me," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I'm already dead." And with that, she lunged. Maria drew her weapon and fired, the deafening crack of the gunshot shattering the night. But the woman didn't stop. She moved through the bullet, her form flickering like a distorted projection. Maria turned and ran, her boots slipping on the frost as she sprinted back to her cruiser. She didn't dare look back. She threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it. Her hands fumbled for the ignition, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The engine roared to life, and she hit the gas, speeding away from the bridge. As the bridge disappeared in her rearview mirror, Maria dared to glance back. The woman stood in the middle of the road, her hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Maria didn't stop driving until she reached the station. She burst through the doors, her face pale, her hands still trembling. Her partner, Officer Ray Delgado, looked up from his desk, startled. "Maria, what the hell happened?" he asked. Maria opened her mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She shook her head, sinking into a chair and burying her face in her hands. The next day, Maria pulled the file on Whitmore Bridge. The reports of accidents and disappearances stretched back decades, but one case caught her eye. A young woman named Lily Harper who had gone missing in 1987. Witnesses claimed to have seen her on the bridge the night she disappeared, pacing near the edge. Her body was never found. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the woman on the bridge and Lily Harper were one and the same, but she also knew no one would believe her. She filed her report, leaving out the details of what she'd seen, and returned to her patrols. But every time she drove past Whitmore Bridge, she felt the same chill, the same oppressive weight. And sometimes in the dead of night, she thought she could hear faint sobbing carried on the wind. She never stopped to investigate again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Officer Daniel Reeds had always believed there were explanations for everything. Logic and reason guided his work on the force for over 15 years. Break-ins, disturbances, missing persons. Every case had a cause, a culprit, or a chain of events that could be pieced together. But there was one night, deep in the fall of 2014, when all the rules he believed in unraveled. The call came through around 11:30 p.m., just as he was finishing his patrol along the outskirts of Old Briar Hollow, a desolate, nearly abandoned town that most people avoided. Once a bustling mining community, it had emptied out after a collapse killed dozens of workers in the 1960s. What remained were a few crumbling houses, a church, and the old police station, which locals swore was haunted. Tonight, the call came from there. "Dispatch, say again?" Daniel asked into his radio, the static thick as the connection faltered. "Disturbance reported at 83 Main Street, Old Briar Hollow Police Station," the dispatcher repeated, her voice tense. "Caller reports seeing a figure inside the building, possible trespasser." "Copy that," Daniel replied, suppressing a sigh. "On my way." The old station had been decommissioned decades ago. It was an eyesore on the edge of town, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Kids from the neighboring town loved to dare each other to go inside, swearing they heard voices or footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Daniel had been called there before, usually finding nothing but signs of teenagers sneaking in to drink or vandalize. The drive was quiet, the winding road flanked by skeletal trees. Fog had begun to roll in, clinging low to the ground and making the headlights seem dimmer. When Daniel pulled up to the station, the sight of the dilapidated building struck him. The place always looked like it was leaning, weighed down by its own history. Stepping out of his cruiser, Daniel adjusted his flashlight and unholstered his gun. He scanned the perimeter, his breath fogging in the cold air. The moonlight was faint, and the building loomed like a shadow against the gray sky. "South County Police," he called out, his voice echoing. "If anyone's in there, make yourself known." No response. The place was silent except for the faint rustle of the wind through the broken windows. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as it swayed. Daniel pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling paint and crumbling plaster of the entryway. Inside, the air was thick and musty. Faded wanted posters still hung on the walls, their corners curled and yellowed with age. A desk lay overturned, papers scattered across the floor. Daniel's boots crunched on the debris as he moved cautiously through the main hall. "Anyone here?" he called again. "This is private property. You need to come out now." There was a sound, a faint shuffling, like footsteps, coming from deeper within the building. Daniel's grip on his flashlight tightened. He followed the noise, his light sweeping across the dusty floor and empty rooms. The footsteps led him to the holding cells at the back of the station. The air here was colder, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The cells were empty, their doors hanging open. But as Daniel stepped closer, he noticed something that made him stop. A faint outline of footprints trailed across the dust-covered floor, leading into one of the cells. The prints were bare, as though someone had been walking without shoes. They ended abruptly in the center of the cell. Daniel's pulse quickened. He shone his flashlight into the cell, but it was empty. No one could have escaped without leaving tracks leading back out. The radio at his shoulder crackled to life, making him jump. "Unit 12, what's your status?" the dispatcher asked. He reached for the radio, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "I'm inside the building. No sign of anyone so far. Just some old footprints. I'll finish checking and report back." As he clipped the radio back, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the station. Daniel spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound had come from the front of the building. He made his way back, his boots heavy on the floor, but when he reached the entryway, the door was closed, and something else was off. The desk he'd passed earlier, the one that had been overturned, was now upright, the papers neatly stacked. A chair sat in front of it, its legs aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk. Daniel stared at it, his heart hammering. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but tinged with unease. There was a pause, and then, faintly, he heard it. A voice. It was low and garbled, as though coming from underwater. He couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from the hallway to his left. Daniel moved toward the sound, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The hallway seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper. The voice grew louder, clearer. "Help me." It was a man's voice, weak and filled with desperation. Daniel quickened his pace, his instincts as an officer taking over. He followed the voice to what had once been the interrogation room. The door was ajar, the light inside flickering weakly. Pushing the door open, Daniel stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy. The light bulb above flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. "Who's there?" Daniel asked, his voice echoing. "If you need help, come out where I can see you." The voice came again, closer this time. "You didn't help me." Daniel spun around, but there was no one there. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing inward. He could hear his own breathing, fast and shallow, and then the sound of footsteps again, running, this time, down the hallway. He bolted out of the room, chasing the sound. His flashlight bounced wildly as he ran, the beam cutting through the darkness. The footsteps led him to the stairs leading to the basement, a place he hadn't intended to check. The basement door stood open, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but the voice came again, echoing up from the depths. "Why didn't you help me?" Steeling himself, Daniel descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. The basement was pitch black, the flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into what had once been a storage area. Old filing cabinets and shelves lined the walls, their contents long forgotten. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was a man, his back to Daniel. He wore a tattered uniform, a police officer's uniform, though it was outdated by decades. His shoulders were slumped, and his hands hung limply at his sides. "Sir, turn around slowly," Daniel ordered, his voice firm, though his stomach churned. The figure didn't move. Daniel took a step closer, his flashlight trained on the man. I said, "Turn around." The man's head tilted slightly, and then he turned, his movements jerky and unnatural. When Daniel saw his face, he froze. The man's eyes were dark hollows, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his bones. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. It was a chorus of voices, layered and distorted. "You didn't help us." Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The figure began to move toward him, its hollow eyes locked on his. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls closing in as the voices grew louder, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. Panicking, Daniel turned and ran, his boots pounding on the stairs as he climbed back to the main floor. The voices followed him, echoing through the building. When he reached the front door, it was open, the cold night air rushing in. He didn't stop running until he reached his cruiser. Jumping inside, he slammed the door and started the engine. As he sped away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the doorway of the station, watching him. And just before it disappeared into the shadows, Daniel swore he saw others behind it. More figures, more faces, all staring at him with hollow eyes. He never went back to the station after that night. The report he filed simply stated, "Building searched, no suspect found." But Daniel knew the truth. Some calls can't be explained. Some places hold memories too dark to forget. And some cries for help come from those who can never be saved.
Story number 8.
Officer Jacob Harlow had heard his fair share of ghost stories. Every town seemed to have its local legend, and the sleepy rural community of Mill Creek was no exception. Tales of haunted barns, shadowy figures in the woods, and ghostly whispers in the old train depot circulated regularly. Jacob didn't believe any of it. He was a practical man, one who trusted evidence, not folklore. But one winter night in 2009 would forever change his understanding of what was possible. It started like any other quiet shift. Jacob was parked in his cruiser on the side of Route 17, a desolate stretch of road lined with skeletal trees. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the asphalt in a thin layer of white. He sipped his coffee and listened to the crackle of the radio, waiting for a call to break the monotony. At 1:47 a.m., it came. Unit 4, respond to a possible disturbance at the old Lockwood house on Briar Street, the dispatcher said. Neighbor reports seeing lights on inside. The property's supposed to be abandoned. Jacob raised an eyebrow. The Lockwood house was infamous around Mill Creek. Built in the 1800s, it had once been a grand home for a wealthy family, but had fallen into disrepair after a series of tragedies. The last known resident, a man named Peter Lockwood, had disappeared without a trace in 1965. Over the years, it had become a magnet for teenagers looking to scare each other and the occasional vagrant seeking shelter. "Copy that. Dispatch," Jacob replied. He put his coffee in the cup holder, flipped on his headlights, and turned onto Briar Street. The house was easy to spot even through the falling snow. It sat at the end of the road, its silhouette looming against the dark sky. The porch sagged, the shutters hung crookedly, and the roof was partially caved in. Jacob had passed it dozens of times on patrol, but had never needed to go inside. As he pulled up to the property, he noticed something odd. The windows on the second floor glowed faintly, as if lit by a flickering candle. The snow on the driveway was untouched, with no sign of footprints or tire tracks. Jacob frowned. If someone was inside, they'd gotten there without leaving a trace. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I'm on scene at the Lockwood house. Lights visible in the upper windows, but no sign of entry," he reported. 10-4, Unit 4. Proceed with caution." Jacob stepped out of the cruiser, his boots crunching on the snow. The cold bit through his jacket as he approached the front door. It hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. He drew his flashlight and shined it inside. The beam illuminated a dusty, cobweb-covered foyer, the wallpaper peeling from the walls. "South County Police," he called out. "If anyone's in here, make yourself known." The only response was the faint groan of the house settling. Jacob stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Dust particles danced in the beam of light as he moved cautiously through the entryway. He checked the main floor room by room. The furniture was still there, covered in yellowed sheets, but there was no sign of anyone. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The house felt abandoned, but the light from the second floor nagged at him. "Anyone up there?" he called, directing his voice toward the staircase. "This is private property. You need to come down now." Silence. Jacob's grip on the flashlight tightened as he ascended the stairs. They groaned under his weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. When he reached the top, he saw that the light was coming from a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, the flickering glow spilling out into the corridor. "Last warning," Jacob shouted. "I'm coming in." He pushed the door open, his flashlight sweeping the room. It was a bedroom, sparsely furnished with an old bed frame, a dresser, and a rocking chair. On the dresser sat a single candle, its flame flickering. But what caught Jacob's attention was the rocking chair. It was moving. The chair rocked back and forth, its motion slow and deliberate. Jacob scanned the room, his heart pounding. There was no one there. No wind, no draft, nothing that could explain the chair's movement. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the frigid air. As he reached out to stop the chair, a cold breeze brushed past him, sending a shiver down his spine. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jacob whirled around, his flashlight darting across the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. "This isn't funny." A faint sound reached his ears, a whisper, barely audible. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He strained to make out the words. "Leave." The whisper was followed by a loud crash from downstairs. Jacob bolted for the door, yanking it open and racing down the hall. As he descended the stairs, his flashlight flickered, plunging him into darkness for a split second before the beam returned. When he reached the bottom, he saw the source of the noise. The front door, which had been ajar when he arrived, was now wide open. Snow blew in, dusting the floor, but the footprints on the porch, the ones he had left moments ago, were gone. Jacob's breathing quickened as he stepped outside, scanning the property. The snow continued to fall, erasing any sign of activity. He turned to look back at the house, and that's when he saw it. A figure stood in the second-floor window, silhouetted by the faint glow of the candlelight. It was tall and motionless, its face obscured. Jacob raised his flashlight, but before the beam could reach the window, the light upstairs extinguished. The figure disappeared. He didn't wait to investigate further. Jacob climbed into his cruiser and radioed dispatch. "Dispatch? This is Unit 4. No suspects found. The property appears secure. I'm clearing the scene." 10-4, Unit 4, return to patrol. He didn't mention the rocking chair or the figure in the window. What would he even say? No one would believe him. In the years that followed, Jacob avoided Briar Street whenever he could. The Lockwood house was eventually torn down, the land sold to developers. But Jacob never forgot what he saw that night, and sometimes late at night, he would wake with the faint sound of whispers in his ears. He never worked another night shift after that. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The call came through at 3:15 a.m. Officer Clara Ramirez had just finished her third cup of coffee, sitting in her cruiser at the edge of town, when the radio crackled to life. Unit 7, report of a 1066 at 240 Harper Lane, the dispatcher said. Clara frowned. Harper Lane was in a part of town she avoided unless absolutely necessary. The old Ridley textile mill was there, a sprawling, abandoned property that loomed like a ghost of its own. The 1066, a suspicious person, was likely just a trespasser, but the mill's reputation always gave her pause. Locals swore it was haunted, cursed by the hundreds of workers who died there over decades due to poor working conditions and, infamously, a fire in 1923 that killed 43 people trapped inside. Clara keyed the mic. Unit 7 en route. The roads were eerily quiet as she drove toward the mill. The dense fog that hung over the town that night seemed thicker near Harper Lane, swallowing the beams of her headlights. Clara pulled up to the chain-link fence that surrounded the property, its rusted metal sagging in places. The mill's tall smokestacks jutted into the night sky, their silhouettes stark against the dim glow of the moon. Clara stepped out of her cruiser, her boots crunching on the gravel. She scanned the area with her flashlight. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. Her breath was visible in the freezing air as she approached the gate, which hung open on its hinges. Dispatch, Unit 7. Arrived on scene. Gates open, Clara said into her radio. Copy that, Unit 7. Proceed with caution, the dispatcher replied. Clara pushed the gate open farther, the metal screeching loud enough to set her teeth on edge. She stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the overgrown lot. The mill loomed ahead, its broken windows and crumbling walls seeming to stare back at her. "Anyone here?" Clara called out. Her voice echoed, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. She made her way to the main entrance of the mill, the heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. A gust of cold air greeted her as she stepped inside, carrying with it the smell of mold and decay. The interior was a maze of rusting machinery, collapsed beams, and shattered glass. "Police! If anyone's in here, come out now!" Clara shouted. Her words were met with a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like footsteps, but not quite. It was softer, uneven, coming from deeper within the building. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and drew her sidearm, her heart pounding as she followed the sound. The tapping led her to a narrow staircase at the back of the mill. It spiraled up into the darkness, the steps covered in years of dust and grime. Clara hesitated. Something about the stairs felt wrong, like they stretched further than they should. The tapping stopped. Clara swallowed hard and began to climb, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself were pressing down on her. When she reached the top, she found herself in what had once been the mill's administrative office. The room was empty except for a large wooden desk and a single chair. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age. In the center of the desk was an old rotary phone. It was black, its cord frayed, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. And then it rang. The shrill sound shattered the silence, making Clara jump. Her flashlight wavered as she stared at the phone, disbelief washing over her. "Dispatch Unit 7, she said into her radio, her voice trembling. "I'm inside the mill. No sign of anyone, but I've got a ringing phone. Stand by." "Unit 7, repeat," the dispatcher replied, static crackling. Before Clara could answer, the phone stopped ringing. The silence that followed was suffocating. She stepped closer to the desk, her boots crunching on the brittle papers. Just as she reached out to touch the phone, a whisper filled the room. "Help us." Clara froze. The whisper had come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming before going out completely. She tapped it against her palm, but it refused to turn back on. In the darkness, she heard it again. "Help us." Her radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the static. "Unit 7, do you copy? Clara, what's your status?" Before she could respond, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Clara spun around, her gun raised. The office was bathed in faint moonlight filtering through a broken window, and standing in the far corner was a figure. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned work clothes, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to bore into her soul. He raised a hand, pointing to the floor beneath the desk. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to move, to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The man opened his mouth, and a guttural, choking sound escaped like the last breaths of a drowning victim. The floor beneath the desk creaked, and Clara's flashlight suddenly flickered back on. She aimed it at the floor, and what she saw made her stomach drop. The boards were rotted and loose, revealing a small crawl space. Inside, something glinted in the light, a rusted metal box. The figure in the corner was gone. Clara crouched down, her hands trembling as she pried the boards apart. She pulled the box out, its surface corroded with age. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing a bundle of papers and a small leather-bound notebook. The papers were payroll records dated 1923, with dozens of names crossed out. The notebook contained frantic handwritten entries. "Fire spreading. They locked the doors. No way out. They knew it was unsafe. We'll haunt this place until someone listens." Clara's radio crackled again. "Unit 7, are you there? Clara, respond. Dispatch," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I found something. I'll explain when I get back." As she stood to leave, the air around her grew heavy, almost suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping one another. "Help us. Tell them. They must know." Clara ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. She climbed into her cruiser, gripping the rusted box like a lifeline. The whispers faded as she sped away from the mill, but the weight of what she'd found stayed with her. The next day, Clara turned the box over to the Historical Society and reported the incident to her department. She never went back to the mill, but the story of what she found spread through Mill Creek. A week later, the remains of a padlocked door were uncovered in the basement of the mill. Behind it were skeletal remains, dozens of them, workers who had been trapped during the fire. The discovery made headlines, and the mill was finally demolished a year later. Clara left the police force not long after. She moved to a neighboring town, far from Harper Lane, but sometimes on quiet nights she could still hear the whispers. "Help us! Tell them!" Story the end.